So to get us kicked off, so we've gone through and we've had 4 days of incredible talks. Heard from so many different perspectives. So I would love to know what has emerged as something that we all have significant consensus on. What do we all agree on around these topics of responsible and society-centered AI? And this is a question for everyone, so whoever wants to go first.
I think one thing that we all have consensus on is AI is a big deal and it's going to make a big difference in our lives. We have consensus that it's coming very quickly and that we have to think in advance about it. The other thing I would throw out for consensus is that we need diverse perspectives, that no one of us has the golden key that's going to make it all safe and solve all the problems. And so we have to listen to each other. And that means different groups in society. It means different academic fields. Without that diversity and without the conversation, I see Peter nodding there. His new book is all about this, and so I think that's one thing that I didn't hear anybody disagreeing with, but maybe I'll find out now.
I can chime on. I do not disagree with anything Walter said. I think one thing we can all agree upon is that Brene and Chris run an amazing conference, right?
You're here.
But getting back to the substance, I think one thing that is also clear that I think we all agree upon is AI is not just one thing, right? We heard about it from Jan LeClune. We've heard about it that there are all these different types of technologies, and what it is on Monday could be very different than what it is on Friday because it keeps changing. And also, there's just a myriad of different use cases. And we've heard a lot about how, we've heard how it's used in the medical profession, how it's used in financial services. So when we think about AI and we think about, harnessing the benefits and protecting people against the risks, we have to think about it broadly and think across all these different use cases.
I think one thing we also heard a lot about from several different speakers is, even though AI is not exactly like what we've seen in the past, there's a lot of learnings we can take. So for example, J. Nathan Matthias on Saturday was talking about what can we learn from the regulation of like milk and chemicals. And while it's not exactly analogous, obviously, I think there were a lot of really cool lessons I had never heard of, as a computer scientist. And today Ronnie Chatterjee was talking about, how can we think about AI from the perspective of different technological innovations and revolutions we've seen over the last like 200 years. And I think events like this obviously allow us to bring people together with, as Walter was saying, those different perspectives to think about how can we learn from what we've seen before.
I agree with all of that. I think the only thing maybe I'd add, which was implied in what you guys said, and you mentioned this, but I think it should be said explicitly, is that almost everyone here, I think, recognizes AI's incredible benefits as well as its potential to cause harm. And I think that's important to emphasize because I think a lot of people think when you see a title like this, Symposium, it's only about people who are terrified of AI and only are worried about its negative impacts. And I hope that what we all can take away is that most people, at least in these rooms, maybe not everyone, but most people see and they're not just enthusiastic about it, feel like it's part of our moral imperative to make sure AI gets out there and we can reap its benefits for society. And we have to work on figuring out how to mitigate its harms.
Thank you. And conversely, what remains the most contentious point of disagreement and meaningful disagreement that you've observed here or elsewhere?
Should we keep the same order? I'll build on something Lee said. There's so many different forms of AI. I heard a lot of different perspectives on large language models and their promise and their dangers. Some people seem to be very optimistic about them helping in tremendous ways in society, and others think, it's not really AI at all. It's just a little prediction here and there about single words, and they're like putting it down. And yet other people put a lot of emphasis. So I heard there was a point of contention. Are large language models a central part of the future of AI, or are they a passing phase that will be gone in a couple of years?
And it came up in Dr. LeClune's speech is, what I heard loud and clearly from him is that, yes, these models are getting smarter, the technology is developing, but we are quite far away from general artificial intelligence. And there certainly are schools of thought out there. And I think we've heard some people in the symposium express a view that AGI is actually a lot closer than we think. And there's people who think AI presents an existential risk very, very soon. So I think, what is the risk, and how do we go about? I don't think anyone disagrees that we need to keep the risks under control, but how to go about doing it? Should there came up in the last presentation? Should we have a lot of regulation? What's the role of law, or should we use other types of mechanisms to try to contain the risk?
I think one thing, people have been pretty civil. I would say there's been no shouting matches that I've heard so far. But I think one point that's come up and is I think a lot of uncertainty about like the future of work and what employment's going to look like and whether, with automation, we're going to see. So I think there's, I remember one conversation on Friday of, if we bring in AI agents, does that lead to unemployment or does that mean we're going to be able to create more than we were before? And, we saw this this morning as well with Ronnie Chatterjee's talk where he said, here are 4 very different, very credible estimates from, really eminent economists in the area. So I think that's one place that's still a really open question that people disagree on.
Those were all really good observations. I'm always a little nervous when you're asking the whole panel, and I'm going to be the last one if we keep the order. But I do still have one. I don't need to go first next. But another thing that I heard, which wasn't always said explicitly, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't, other times it was kind of inferring between the lines, is that I think there's still a lot of disagreement about who should take responsibility for what aspects of the harms and in what way. That still seems to be very much up in the air with a lot of contention.
Yeah, I think this was a great summary. Now, we've talked a lot about responsible AI, and every talk that we've seen has had kind of a different view of what it means to be responsible, what it means to have society-centered AI. So I'd love to ask each one of you, what is your definition of responsible and society-centered AI?
I think Jen ought to go first this time.
Okay. So one thing I take from this question is that it's something I still want to think about. So I'm going to give you a first step, but I think one thing I'm taking away from this conference is I really need to think about a better definition, and I look forward to learning from the rest of you how I can refine it. I'm going to start by telling you something that I learned from a philosophy professor that I had a long time ago. I'm going to start a definition with what it's not, and that's responsible AI in my mind is not compliance. And that's something I really struggle with a lot of my industry colleagues, is they think responsible AI equals something, whatever is legal, and you need to learn about how to navigate that. So here's where I'm currently thinking of AI, or responsible AI. I think for me right now, it is a mission to inspire everyone that interacts with AI in any way to take responsibility for their part in AI's impacts, and to empower them to take the right actions to follow through with that responsibility. I think some critical pieces there are, well, what kinds of consequences should we care about? I would say in a very general way, something that we've kind of heard in multiple ways, that we want to maximize AI's benefits, we want to minimize AI's harms, and we also need to eliminate unacceptable AI harms. That last part's critical. And then the last couple pieces I put that's a little more detailed, that's not concise, so I need to work on this, but is that I think we should, as we're figuring out its consequences, we should be putting extra weight on consequences that impact life and death. And I think that we should be emphasizing quality of life for all people in the long term over short-term convenience, especially for small groups. And I think that the long term, focusing on long term as well as short term, or often more so than short term, probably should be a critical piece of this whole movement. But I look forward to revising my definition after this panel.
Take a crack building on that. I think it's really important to get out of the mindset to think about it like as a zero-sum game, that it's either the AI or the human, and to be thinking about, how can we as citizens, how can we as people use AI to make outcomes better? So in a lot of cases, like you think about the medical context or some of the high-risk contexts, it's not a question of whether it's going to be a doctor or the AI doing this, but it's a question of how can a doctor use the AI to try to help improve outcomes, to help the doctor do his or her job better. And I think, when we think about human-centered artificial intelligence, it's looking at it like we have this tool. And as I talked about in my speech for the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety, one of the things that was underscored, and it was led by Yashua Bengio, is, we humans have a lot of choice over how these outcomes come. And I think it's thinking about how can we make sure we're using this to get back to what Jenna was saying. So we're optimizing benefits, mitigating risk, and making sure that we're not putting people out of jobs. And how do we start reskilling the labor force, educating people so they're meeting the technology where it is.
Maybe answer from like the computer science perspective, just because I feel like you guys were pretty comprehensive with what I wanted to say. The switch to order is really throwing me off. If I think about what it means to do like responsible machine learning and, in my domain, healthcare, I think, one is something that's been alluded to, but I think a lot of it is, how do you choose what problems to work on? And then I think another, huge portion is, how do we communicate what we've done? I think we're sort of in this age of a huge amount of hype. And a lot of it's warranted, but some of it isn't. And I think, our responsibility, particularly as academics, is making sure we communicate very clearly the scopes and limitations of, the systems we build.
I'm just going to blatantly pander to Chris and Brene, because I'm going to say responsible AI is just society-centered AI. The point of responsible AI is that the goal of an AI company is not just to fill the pockets of the president of the company or to provide jobs to the workers. The central motivation should be to help society. And I would even go further and say humanity-centered AI, because so often it's not just one particular society, but has effects around the world. So responsible AI, as I understand it, is AI companies that are aimed at helping society and humanity. And then what about the AI itself? Well, many AI programs have objectives, and we need to build those objectives, not just accomplish this goal, but rather to act in a way, to make decisions in a way, to choose methods in a way that will help society and humanity. That's what I would call responsible AI.
Well, I certainly hope this was recorded so that we have these definitions to add to the Webster Dictionary. Thank you all. So the next portion of our panel is going to be individual questions. So I'll ask somebody individually a specific question, but then everyone else can chime in with their thoughts and opinions. All right, so Jana, you're up first. So the responsible AI field inherently requires expertise from computer science and engineering, philosophy and ethics, sociology, psychology, law, many other disciplines. As someone who bridges multiple disciplines yourself, I would love to ask how we can create genuine interdisciplinary collaborations rather than simply placing people from different fields in the same room.
Yeah, I will warn you, this is something I could talk about for days, so I'm going to try to be concise, and I'll fail, I'm sure. The first thing is to recognize it's actually a lot harder than it seems. And I think many people at Duke is we all can acknowledge that Duke is such a great place to do interdisciplinary work. And so I hope that we understand that here at Duke better than others do, but it's a lot harder than it seems. I'll give kind of advice at 3 different levels. One is, if you're interested in doing interdisciplinary work, just putting yourself in the same room as someone else with another discipline is not going to work very well in most cases unless you look out. I think you really need a team that has a common passion, and that passion kind of drives you through a lot of the challenges of working through disciplinary unique aspects and motivations and incentives. At the kind of broader level, alluded to these skills you need. There really are some skills that you really need to build to do interdisciplinary work well, and we take them for granted. Sometimes they're called soft skills, sometimes they aren't. Some of them are very technical skills, in my opinion. But I think that both learning how to build yourself and also providing ways to train our communities and our trainees and people in skills like how do you communicate? Here's an important one. Most of us in academia, especially if you're older, I'd like to think I'm not too old yet, but I'm still older. We were trained in a way that you had to have a specific discipline, right? So when you're trained in that discipline, you're supposed to be the world's best expert in that thing. And now in interdisciplinary work, you're supposed to go into something where you're by definition not going to be the best. Right? You're trying to figure out something new. And so that actually takes a tremendous amount of emotional skill. It takes kind of a way of reframing your mind, and also skills like how do you get up to speed as quickly as possible in something you don't know about? How do you also sift through the literature? The more disciplines you start putting together, you really have to build a skill of how do you sift through things and find the most important aspects. You also have to develop really good listening skills, and that's something that's kind of undervalued often in academia as well, and I could go on and on. So those, I think there's a whole cluster of things that we should build as many resources as possible for. And then the other pitch I'll make is that I think that we need some institutional investment. And again, Duke has done a lot of this, and I would just like to make a pitch for it to go even further. And I think sometimes Duke wonders, is all of the investment we've made in some of our infrastructure, like institutes, like research professors, is it worth it? Do we get the ROI? And as I've gone through different versions, I would say you have to go kind of all in to really reap the ROI. So one piece of advice I've been given over and over and over again in my career is you can't do interdisciplinary work until you have tenure. And I have to say, as anyone who knows me knows, I'm not great at following rules all the time, so I didn't always follow that, but it hasn't been easy. So if I advise trainees, I make them really think about it. But that's something that we can think about institutionally. So how can you make it easier? Why do you have to wait for tenure? Because the way we're evaluated is by how many last author or first author papers you have and how many grants you have. And there are way more disciplinary publication venues than there are interdisciplinary ones. And there are way more grants for disciplines than there are for interdisciplinary grants. And often when you're hired, even if you're hired into an institute, they want to say, first, what department do you belong in? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to be really creative, to be a world leader for Duke, but also for other institutions to think about how can we be innovative in what kind of structures we provide for people to do this kind of work. And I don't think we want it to be the case that only tenured professors in academia are the ones doing the top interdisciplinary work. We heard from Ronnie today that he feels like he's the oldest person in OpenAI, and it's all the younger people. So do we really want it to be the case that we don't have any of those people doing interdisciplinary work in academia? I don't think so. I'll try to stop there. Like I said, I could talk forever, but those are some ideas.
I like to add one more thing that you need for interdisciplinary work, and the answer is mocktails, or maybe even better, cocktails. But the point is, you got to have fun. I mean, seriously, you talk to people from other fields, they're not going to keep talking to you if they're not having fun. I mean, one reason Janet and I have worked together for decades is she's a lot of fun. And
Walter's a lot of fun, too.
And if you don't have that, then your interdisciplinary introduction is never going to become something that's developed enough to actually do some good. And so I, again, want to pander to Chris and Brene for making this Responsible AI Symposium so much fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Walter. And I think something that is common among everyone here is that they are very interdisciplinary. And I'd love to ask, how do you get over that uncomfortable feeling when you don't know something? You know, you're an expert in your own discipline or multiple disciplines in some of our cases. How do you get over the uncomfortable feeling of looking up at a slide and looking at a model architecture and being like, I have no idea what's going on? Or reading a sociology book, I read Chris's book, and not understanding all of the methods and having to go and look up different terminology, right? How do you go about this process? I don't know if any of you have any thoughts.
Yeah, so I would say I am very much pre-tenure, and I do live in 2 different departments, so hopefully that's not an issue. But I'm someone who is both in the School of Medicine and in computer science, and but I'm a kind of a computer scientist by training through and through. And basically, my first year of grad school, there was this program that I was a participant in where they basically wanted to teach engineers enough medicine so that we could communicate. And the very first class, there was an icebreaker question. And it was like, what's your favorite something? And it was some biological term, I can't even remember. And I was like, I don't even know what that word is, much less what my favorite, version of that is. Well, the bio students are kind of shouting things out. So, that class was a lot of me Googling the words the professor said as he said them. But I'm a pretty fast typer, so it worked out. But I do think, putting myself in those courses where I was taking classes at the School of Medicine to give me the basic vocabulary to talk to people in different disciplines. But then I think, as Walter said, putting yourself in fun situations. I have friends who are, one of my best friends is a cognitive scientist, and we just started chatting about AI because we like talking to each other. And, that became a paper alongside like a surgeon recently. So I think it's important to just create a space where those conversations can occur.
I guess I would just add, I mean, you just kind of have to have the hunger and the thirst for knowledge, which is, I think, something that Ronnie said earlier today. I mean, for me, because like this is career, I think 2.0 at this point. I was a undergraduate here studying engineering. Then I went to law school. I practiced law at a big law firm for 30 years. And then I came back and I started out in the law school. And now I've got 3 appointments and none of them are in law between Pratt, Science and Society, and the medical school. And my kids are like, I don't quite understand all of this. But, I think another key, so one is just putting yourself out there. I think another is not being shy about asking questions. People love to talk about what they do. And as long as you've got some educated questions, I used to do this when I was practicing law. You ask the client, it's like, well, I've read about your business, but tell me a little bit more about this. And it's another way to learn and start breaking down some of those barriers.
I just wanted to mention that I did a lot in medicine was I did a lot of clinical shadowing. Before I even like wrote a single line of code, it was really let me watch the process because I think there's often a lot of hubris in tech. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And I think it, brings a lot of humility to kind of actually watch the process that you want to impact take place and understand where the real roadblocks are. Because I think I often would then shadow and realize, this machine learning thing that I thought might help speed things up is not actually the problem we need to solve. So I think having the humility to watch without trying to do for a while.
I agree with a couple of things I might add are that for those of you who are thinking about it or nervous about it, it gets easier with practice. So the more it just gets, you realize, oh, you can do this, and you can see other people do it. So, jump in and it'll get easier each time. The other thing is I think there is a great role that facilitators and leaders and educators can play, which is from the beginning, kind of setting out this expectation of, first of all, a growth-based mindset, like we all have something to learn. There's kind of a leadership theory of, when you have a team, everyone is bringing something to the table and kind of setting that expectation. And so there's a lot of cultural things I think facilitators, leaders, educators can do at whatever level of society we're talking about that can also make it easier to take that first step.
Amazing. Thank you all. All right, I'm going to change directions a little bit. I have a question now for you, Walter. I'd love to understand your thoughts on this tricky dilemma we face with responsible and society-centered AI. There are no clear right answers. So how should we think about these gray areas of responsible AI development and use?
First of all, I want to disagree with the question. I think there are some clear right answers. It's just they're no fun to talk about because everybody already agrees on them. I mean, AI systems should not be like destroying our society in order to fill their pockets with gold. I mean, I think there are some pretty clear answers that almost everybody agrees on, but it's not much of a symposium if we hold it on that. And so we focus on the ones where there are no clear right answers. And then how should we react to that? We should go, great. I love it when there's not a clear right answer and you hold a different view than I do because I can learn from you. If we agree and talk about it, I'm not going to learn anything. But if we disagree and I honestly ask you, what exactly do you mean by that? Are you talking about this kind of case? Why do you hold that view? What are your reasons for the views that you're taking? Then we can actually learn from each other. And then I also think a lot of the disagreements kind of fall apart because it turns out we're not really talking about the same thing after all. We disagree about these facts, and then when we look them up, oh yeah, okay, now I can agree. And so it seems to me that what we want, the way we deal with disagreement is by asking questions and by talking to each other and by getting straight on the facts and by asking not what do I hold right now, but what would I hold if I were a better person, better informed, more impartial, less biased, and so on. I think that's what we can benefit from when we encounter a disagreement in this area and lots of others.
Yeah, I love that. As a side story, when I first met Walter, we went to lunch, and I was telling him that I was working on some explainable AI stuff, and he was like, "Well, why would you need that?" And then we had a very nice lunch and discussion about it, and so now I understand why.
I would just kind of add on that. It's kind of drawing on my other experiences in practicing law in the policy arena with government, and you can't let perfection necessarily be the enemy of the good. And I always tend to be an optimist. Like I've been doing a ton of work around data scraping, which has come up a couple times, and I'm like, each side has some valid issues, and I'm like, somewhere you just have to keep talking to people, right? Like, what are your concerns? How can we find a solution? And it's like somewhere beneath the controversy and the disagreement lurks a win-win. And it's really just a question of kind of peeling back the layers of the onion to try to find that. So sometimes, like, you really do have, should somebody do something that kills people and harms people? Obviously, no. Those are the easy questions we don't answer. But like on some of the ones where there are grays and where reasonable minds can differ, it's really a question of just trying to work through it, trying to understand, trying to forge a little bit of consensus and agreement.
That segues really nicely into my next question, which is for both Walter and Jana. So, if you weren't here on Saturday, they gave a wonderful talk of their recent book, Moral AI and How We Get There. And I would love to know, so for those of you who haven't read the book, you should. And we have Walter, who's a philosopher, Jana, who's a neuroscientist, and then Vincent Conitzer, the third author, is a computer scientist. And they came together to write this book. I'd love to know what sparked that, and is there anything we can learn from your collaboration as we think about developing responsible AI collaboratively as a community?
I honestly don't remember how we started working together. It might be what Walter said, which is fun. I mean, if you guys don't know Walter yet, you should. He's a lot of fun, and Vince is also a lot of fun. So I don't know if you remember how it
So
originally.
I remember meeting Vince very distinctly because Vince came over to the philosophy department and sat on the back row and listened to talks. And I love this. This is great advice if you want to meet somebody who's really cool. Like you look at these talks and you look at the person on the back row and you see like when they squint and when they go like this and when and you look at their facial expressions. He never asked a question. He didn't want to interfere because he's coming over to the other campus, And so I said, this is like the second or third talk that he came to. I went up to him afterwards. I said, so what did you think of that? Brilliant. Just like unbelievably insightful, great question. And we've been friends ever since. So I remember that distinctly. And I thought, I want to work with this guy. So let's talk some more about things we could do together. And I said, let's bring along Gianna. She's fun. And so we brought along.
Gotta bring something to the table.
And so that's the way I remember it. Is seeing Vince on the back row of the philosophy department talks, and not interfering and being very humble and kind to everyone, but brilliant when you went out of your way and asked him a question. So that's what I would suggest everyone should do.
I mean, because this isn't just about us. This is what you guys can what we can offer about the process. I would say that this particular collaboration, I'm really lucky to have many interdisciplinary collaborations. This one is special in my mind because the values of the people in our group align so well. So I really feel like Walter and Vince, truly want to do the best for society, and I hope that they feel the same for me. I certainly aspire to do that, and then when I went back to kind of this, the passion that is at the center of an interdisciplinary group, I think that truly, it's really real for us. And so it motivates everything we do. So we all have different incentives and we have different, things we're supposed to be doing for our different departments or whatever. But because that is a true passion for all of us, it motivates this work. And we all really felt like we wanted to help people get involved with this very important topic that we believe deeply in. And so it felt kind of like a moral imperative, truly, to write the book, even though we ended up writing part of it during the pandemic over babies and other things. And the other thing I would say is that I've really valued, I just wish everyone could have the same experience of having someone from the technical side, someone from the ethical side, someone from I never know. I'm not allowed. I don't know if I'm allowed to call myself a social scientist these days. I'm in the Social Science Research Institute now, moving over from the medical center. I study social neuroscience and other things, but I'm not a social scientist by some qualities. But anyway, people like something from a biological and social domain, we really push on each other. We don't always agree, but it really helps you think more rigorously, expansively, and I think cohesively in a way that matters when you really truly engage with people and put yourself in others' shoes. Like having to think as a computer scientist has really helped me think more about the brain, pushing back on what I know about how humans make decisions has kind of, I hope, forced both Walter and Vince to think about what's realistic for humans to do and what other types of approaches we might need to build into AI. And Walter is always helping us think of better frameworks than either Vince or I come up with on our own about ethical ways or kind of structures to think about our computations. So I wish everyone could have that kind of exchange, and I hope everyone can seek it out.
And if you're looking for some fun, we're going to have mocktails in just a little bit. So if you want to find some collaborators that are fun, definitely join us for that in just a few minutes. But before that, Lee, I have a question for you. So we often frame AI governance discussions around finding this balance between innovation and safety. My question for you is the framing of this itself problematic? And are there alternative frameworks that might better capture this, complex interplay of human values that are at stake here?
I don't view them as being mutually exclusive. We want safe innovation on the marketplace. So when we focus on developing innovation that's going to be beneficial for our society and society focus, it needs to be safe. And I think, a lot of the work that is being done through different government institutes, for example, NIST, how do we develop AI risk management frameworks, is all focused about unleashing innovation, but doing it safely, speaking in my personal capacity. But I think where sometimes it gets a little, people start to view them as mutually exclusive is when people talk about what sort of regulation should we have. So, for example, in Europe, they've adopted the EU AI Act, which has very prescriptive regulations around artificial intelligence, and that's the Europeans expressing their value that safety is really important, although their policy documents say innovation is important too. And even in the United States, President Biden had signed an executive order that was very comprehensive. I mean, it doesn't compare to what the Europeans have done, but it did include some requirements about large language models having to conduct certain testing. What President Trump has said, he issued an executive order in his first week on AI where he rescinded that, and they're still developing the AI action plan for the new administration, but he's very clear that the focus from his perspective is on innovation. So I think, where people and people interpret that as perhaps prioritizing safety a little bit less than in the Biden administration. So I think when we talk about government policy, that's where people, and regulatory approach, that's where people tend to think it's mutually exclusive. But, people here in the room, when you're thinking about in your labs, thinking about how do we develop safe innovation.
Thank you.
So I'll just add, I think one of the problems is short-term thinking. That if a company says, we want to release our product today, and a regulation says, no, we've got to double check that and talk to some people before it's released, they think, oh, no, that's horrible. You're stopping innovation. And what they forget is that in the longer term, if we release products that aren't safe and that end up hurting society, the regulations are going to be even worse, and there'll be even worse restrictions on innovation. So let's start to think long term instead of short term.
All right, Monica, you have my next question. Over the symposium, we've heard from industry leaders, we've heard from policymakers, academic researchers, and their views on responsible AI use and development have been different. And you straddle both of those worlds, right? You are a co-founder of a startup, and you are a professor here at Duke. So I'd love to know how you navigate, kind of these two different worlds that have sometimes competing perspectives. So what tensions do you experience with these roles, and does that a dual perspective give you any unique insights into when you're thinking about bridging responsible AI use and development?
Thanks for the question. So, I mean, I think to some extent, I think about it the way Walter just described it, which is, short term, you might be able to get a product out really fast if you're not responsible. But, longer term, you're not going to sort of build the connections that are required to build trust. And so I work in machine learning for health. So it's a health tech company. And I think, compared to something that might be like very consumer focused, obviously, if you're working with a health system, they hugely care about, responsibility, transparency, and interpretability in what you provide them. So I think I've been lucky, and I think this is, sort of by construction, that I haven't had to sort of feel like I had to choose between the two. But I'll kind of give some examples to make that concrete. So, one of the things we work on is, how can you use NLP to understand what's already been written in someone's records, so that we can use that to, measure health quality or, understand what treatments have or haven't worked well in the past. And I think that's inherently a question or, an application that has a little more safety baked in. It's very easy to bring a human in the loop. One of the things we did, very first is, how can we make it as easy as possible to show what our models are surfacing and why. So, our founding team includes, yes, like machine learning folks, but also clinicians, but also people who work in human-computer interaction, since what we really cared about in sort of building that team were people who thought about the people on the other side and not, machine learning being the end all be all. And I think that's kind of baked into the product. Whereas, on the research side, I don't have to, worry so much about, I can think about longer term questions, things that might be patient facing, which I wouldn't be comfortable, tackling yet commercially, because I don't think patient-facing systems are quite ready for prime time, in many cases. So I think that's one way I can think about it, is that I have, pretty strong constraints in terms of having to satisfy, health systems and other customers who have been traditionally worried by, AI snake oil, for lack of a better word. I remember really strongly, I went to this Symposium in 2019, and I was a room that was like 95% clinicians at this conference. And, all of the doctors decided at once to talk about how much they hated NLP because none of it worked. And I was just like hiding, being like, good thing they don't know who I am. But I think, in a very real way, I think people have been consistently told, like, AI or computer science can help solve this problem. And, at different points that wasn't quite ready technology wise. So I think, part of what we also are able to sell as the product is, the fact that we are providing the interpretability to understand, when we make a model update, how can we make it really clear? We think it's making it better. How do we visualize that, for the customer?
Yeah, thank you. All right, Lee, I have a question for you. Your role gives you a unique global perspective as you engage with leaders worldwide on AI policy. I'm curious, how do the principles, perspectives, and frameworks we've explored over these past 4 days compare with the conversations that are happening in government and policy circles internationally? And where do you see the most significant alignment or disconnect between the conversations we've had over the past 4 days and conversations that you've been a part of at an international level?
So I think, there's, I think, a lot of alignment, and I brought this up when I gave my talk. For example, Toddy Steelman helped kick us off and talked about AI in the environment. And when we're talking about globally, that's an issue that's getting a lot of attention. I think some of the themes that we've discussed here today are all being dealt with, at the international level. I think the added dimension at the international level is like how to deal with the geopolitics of all of this. We want everybody to be able to benefit from responsible technology, including in the global south. And I gave some examples about, the potential to use AI to help achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. But to do that, we need technology to be able to flow across borders, and we want it to reflect democratic values. and different jurisdictions have different approaches. There's a lot of focus internationally on China, so I think when you start to get out of the domestic setting here, you start adding in all those geopolitical considerations on top of everything else.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. All right, Monica. The discourse around responsible AI frequently centers on preventing harm rather than proactively defining what is beneficial AI. You are working in the healthcare field, and your work is very much about beneficial AI. So, how might shifting from a harm prevention to a more aspirational vision of technology's role in society change our approach to responsible AI development and use?
Thanks. So I alluded to this a little bit on Friday, but there was, a paper I was on with like 20 other people, economists, computer scientists, people in medicine, that talks about, when people talk about how LLMs could affect health, the vast majority of papers talk about how LLMs could exacerbate inequalities and our, existing inequitable healthcare system. And I think it's often important when we I think it's not sufficient to say, hey, we're going to work in healthcare, but it's really about how can we not just recreate the current state of healthcare, but imagine, what are the gaps and where can we actually address those gaps? So as an example, I mentioned, there was a paper that described that, it's often, there's huge disparities if you ask language models to do prescription of painkillers. But I think that's sort of besides the point, because I never want a language model to be prescribing painkillers. On the other hand, some of the things that we bring up in that paper involve, how can we think about increasing diversity in clinical trial matching, where, right now, we see, they often tend to lean white and male, and therefore we might not get generalizable findings. Or how can we try to, study bias in the existing system using, computational science, social science tools over, huge swaths of health data? Or how can we study questions or, understudied diseases? I think there's a lot of research that shows that researcher populations often mirror what diseases get studied. And we know that, researcher populations don't perfectly match patient populations. So I think there's a lot of ways we can think about not just, the focus areas, but also what questions we tackle in those areas.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know all of us on stage really think about this topic very deeply. All right, so our final question, as we conclude this symposium, what is one, and this is for everyone, what is one underexplored area in responsible AI that deserves more attention from the community in the coming year?
Well, I'll throw one out. I'm very interested in the use of AI in the military, not only for cyber warfare, but also for military targeting. And that's something that I think we ought to pay more attention to, because most of us are not involved in that. It's not affecting our day-to-day lives, and so we tend to forget it. But there are some horrendous possibilities there that we really need to think about a lot more deeply than I think most people even feel comfortable thinking about.
I think one thing that I'm thinking a lot about is sort of automation bias. So, I think if you have a lot of the studies we do say, hey, let's pair a human and an AI together for maybe an hour, maybe even a day, and say, like, here's how they work together. But I think a lot of what I'm spending a lot of cycles thinking about is, what happens if they're working together for months? So I think, we had the self-driving car example on Saturday, I think, in terms of if you have a human at the wheel, if they overly trust the automated driver, at what point do they stop sort of paying attention to the road? And I think that's something we're going to see across disciplines, including medicine. And I think there's a lot of room for us to think about, how can we kind of jolt them back to, what are the different techniques we can have to sort of re-engage and provide agency back to the user working with the AI, so that we don't have this sort of loss of agency that we often see.
Great ones. I think the one I'll say is one that's been definitely on my mind for the past year is thinking about empathic AI. So I don't know if you guys have seen some of the reports over the past year, but many chatbots now are rated as more empathic than human doctors, than friends, than many other things. And you might be saying, but that's not real empathy. Or maybe you're saying that is real empathy. We can talk about that too. But the point is that many people are perceiving empathy in these AIs, and as a consequence, there are many things happening. Many people who feel lonely are using AI chatbots as friends, as companions, and I think part of what we need to understand is what's the landscape there. So if you start looking into the data, we know that for some people, that is an incredible help. And people, you can read these testimonials to people who felt like they just had nothing left in life, and these AIs are giving them a support network or giving them a sense of connection that they wouldn't have otherwise. Other people, these exact same chatbots are making them feel worse than they ever did before, because they said, I didn't have any friends before, and now I know this is the only thing that will interact with me, and it's not real, and nothing is making me feel worse about my life. And then you have people who are in between who are saying, okay, I started this because it seemed like it was worth trying. Then I really, really liked it, and now I'm completely addicted to it, even though I know this thing isn't real. And if we don't yet have good data on this, but we know if you start talking to your college students or if you have teenagers, you know that almost all of them are interacting with chatbots on a daily basis, much more so than many people who are older. So I really think we need to understand the consequences of this technology. And it seems like the more empathic or more empathy you perceive from the AI, the more likely you are to divulge information, feel connected to it. And there's a separate component of empathic AI that I think might be involved with the technical ways of figuring out how could we build a morality into an AI most efficiently. And humans, my personal scientific opinion is that empathy is a part of that. So we also need to understand if we should leverage that or not. But I think that whole landscape is something we really need to get on top of sooner rather than later, especially because my intuition is that it's going to impact our most vulnerable populations the most.
I'll conclude, these are all great answers, by focusing on the workforce issues. I mean, AI is changing the way people work. I talk with people in companies all the time, and it's kind of like when open source first became a big thing, and some companies are like, well, we're just going to tell people you can't use it. Well, that doesn't work. So, I think thinking about it even from an educational mission from the university, and I think higher education, K through 12, is struggling with this. How do we as an institution become a leader, and how do we integrate that into our education? How do we prepare the students to go out into the workforce to be able to use it? And, one thing I think we all agree upon, coming back to your first question, is like, this technology is moving so fast. So, Duke students 10 years from now are probably going to be living in a world we can't envision today. And how do we prepare them with the skills so they can continue to adapt and learn as this new technology impacts their lives? And the last thing I'll say on this is, we've talked a lot about the technology, but I'm also a huge fan, I think we've talked about this among ourselves, that the soft skills are just as important, teaching people how to communicate, teaching people how to write. So I think focusing on how do we prepare Duke students, the Duke community, to live in a world where AI is going to be a big part of it. So human-centered AI.
Thank you. And these were all fantastic answers. I think I resonate very much with yours, Lee, because something that I am really thinking a lot about is how can we have more of this interdisciplinary collaboration like we have on this stage right now and in this symposium, especially among scholars, among students. How do we create these communities of people across disciplines that are working together to solve these problems around society-centered AI? All right. We are now at the close of our Responsible AI Symposium. We have mocktails and food in the back. Please
and huge
enjoy.
thanks again to Brene and Chris.
Absolutely. Brene and Chris. Brene and Chris.